Okay, welcome everybody. It's really nice to see this family that's developing every week for the ArtSat seminars. It's really good to have those of you who come regularly, and welcome to those who are coming for the first time. Today I'm chairing Zipho Zinkosi Diayile, who usually chairs and who's the curator of the program, has had a software problem, not she herself. Her computer had a software problem this morning. So I'm chairing. She's online. She's coming online through her phone, but the phone wasn't strong enough to do the whole chairing thing. So you've got me. I'm Bridget Thompson. I'm the executive trustee of the Art and Ubuntu Trust, and I directed the film on Ernest Mancoba that you saw last week, and then curated the exhibition, which was a founding exhibition for the Art and Ubuntu Trust's work. And that was called In the Name of All Humanity, the African Spiritual Expression of Ernest Mancoba. I'm going to talk a little bit about reading the Ancestor before I introduce the speakers, because it's really quite an extraordinary experience. So whilst working with Abdulcadir Ahmed Said, the director of Reading the Ancestor, we visited Ernest Mancoba in Paris, and they got on very well. Ernest Mancoba looked at some of his films, some of his classical films that were made in Somalia before he left, and said, "I'm so happy to see that the spiritual has been maintained." And in a very affectionate way, he called Abdulcadir Madoda. They also had a discussion about racism, which wasn't something that I had raised in my discussions with Ernest very explicitly, but it was something that Abdulcadir felt very keenly, and which Ernest responded to in a very powerful way. Abdulcadir might tell you about his response later in the discussion, because he will be online and able to answer any questions. Anyway, we came back to South Africa. We were busy making a documentary series on music, and while we were making that series, Ernest Mancoba died. He passed away at the age of 98 in 2002, just after he'd given this really powerful interview to Hans Ulrich Obrist, which I really think is his last will and testament. And when we finished the series, it was around about the time what would have been his 100th anniversary, and we'd had many discussions about him. And I felt it was absolutely imperative that we did something in South Africa to commemorate his 100th anniversary and also his passing. And that's how the exhibition came about. And in the process of preparing the exhibition, I was invited to, or asked to come to Iziko National Gallery and look at a painting that they just acquired of Ernest Mancoba. They'd struggled for years to raise the money. They'd raised the money and bought this really lovely work. And in looking at that work, I saw things that I hadn't seen before in Ernest Mancoba's work. I saw the stories within the stories. I saw the Ancestor. I'd seen the Ancestor before, but I suddenly saw the relationship between the stories and the Ancestor, and came back and shared it with Abdulcadir. And then I managed to raise through my film company, Thomas Films, some money to do some video art for the exhibition, and left it in Abdulkadir's hands because I was busy curating the exhibition. And he, at this time, the civil war in Somalia was raging. It had gone into a very particularly painful phase, and that's his home country. And I observed this beautiful communication that he had with Ernest. He was in pain, but also at peace through the discussion that he was having across time and space with Ernest. And he came out of the studio with this astounding short film, which we share with you today. The first speaker today is another artist who's had a very powerful exchange with Ernest Mancoba, Kemang wa Lehulere, who for his prize-winning exhibition as Standard Bank Young Artist Award winner, paid a tribute to Ernest Mancoba, Gladys Mgodlandlu, and H.I. Dlomo. There's a small personal story there, because his uncle, Opa, who's a very old friend and comrade of mine, was always very keen on H.I. Dlomo, and I was always very keen on Sol Plaatje. And during the 80s, during the struggle, we sometimes would stop and have coffee and talk about who was the really significant one in terms of South African arts and culture? Well, I think those debates are pretty meaningless when we realize the array of people who have contributed so significantly, using essentially the same values, but interpreting them in literature, interpreting them in art, interpreting them in music. And it's really a great pleasure to have Kemang with us. And after he speaks, we're going to show the film. And then the next speaker will be Mgcineni Sobopha, lecturer at the University of Fort Hare. And then we'll show the film again. And then we have a speaker coming all the way from London and the Caribbean, Imrubakari, a filmmaker. And then after that, Tando Mama, who I'm glad to see is with us, will pose questions to all the speakers, and we'll have a discussion. For a change, Zipo will be able to participate in the discussion. And just before we start, I'm going to read you Kemang's bio. I'll read the bios of all the speakers just before they speak, so you've got some feeling for who they are. So I'm just going to read it out. So Kemang wa Lehulere's artistic practice reacts to the historical legacy of South Africa, using performative acts with objects and materials familiar to South African society to carve, dig, break, erase, or reconstitute. Objects like wooden school desks, don't we all remember them? Those ubiquitous desks. Ceramic sculptures of Alsatian dogs and blackboards are incorporated into various installations and used as symbols of both an educational system within the apartheid regime and its performance within a contemporary democratic society. The objects transmute between a familiar object from childhood into more pointed questions or concerns that challenge our assumptions about the histories and social structures that shape the world around us. While Lehulere has exhibited in numerous shows and projects locally and internationally, he was a co-founder of the Go Collective in 2006 and Center for Historical Reenactment in Johannesburg. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Kemang and invite him to be the first speaker. Kemang, you will have to unmute your mic. Welcome.
Okay, hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. Can you hear me, Bridget? Okay, yes? Okay, perfect. Okay, so to be honest, for me, I have more questions than answers in terms of my reading the Ancestor. But obviously my reading of it is that it speaks to, well, a number of erasures. The film begins with the original painting. Then there's an instrument, it's a Xhosa instrument called umkhwape, I think. I just discovered that last night. I had thought it was uadi actually, but apparently it's a bit different. So the film begins with the original image of reading the original painting, and then there is some kind of storm or wind that sweeps away the brush marks, if I put it like that, or the image, but quite gently, almost as if it's like leaves being swept by wind in autumn. The image disappears and then reappears, almost as if it becomes a reconstruction, in which my understanding of it, Abdul wanted to contest the various readings of Mancoba's work, which I think is still an ongoing contestation, actually, in terms of where is the true source of his inspiration. And I think Bridget and I have had these discussions, and with other curators from Europe as well, who have always tried to locate Mancoba's practice or his aesthetic within a Western context of abstractionism. But here what we see is Abdul really traces it back to more of a historical African spirituality. In fact, the painting itself, it is said that it is a tribute to Mancoba's great-grandmother who sacrificed her own life so that her family might stay alive while they were fleeing the dictatorship that was imposed by Shaka Zulu's kingdom in the area which is now known as the KZN. And this was this period in time or war was known as Mgcineni. Of course, in Mancoba's imagery and work, for me, my reading of it and also the work that you mentioned from my Standard Bank show, when I had been studying his work, it seemed contrary to what other European writers had been trying to locate him in. And I was seeing in the same way, in fact, that Abdul here has kind of recreated the image into a film. That Mancoba is really influenced by African abstraction or abstract figuration, particularly the quarter figure. Or I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, the kota or kota, because in Setswana or Sesotho you could call it ikota, which is also like a stick that is used in ritual ceremonies for initiation. And obviously the kota or the African sculptures in reference here particularly, as we know, the objects now as they might sit in museums around the world, but oftentimes these were objects that were used in ceremonies, spiritual ceremonies, or social ceremonies sometimes. And these varied from whether it was evoking ancestral worship or sometimes when there was what would be seen or considered an imbalance in society, whether like the crops were not coming as wanted, then sometimes these performances, I like to call them performances, some say rituals, we can debate this, but this is, these were often brought into society to bring back about balance, which in case, for me, I'm reading the video in the same kind of manner. Yeah, and I think, yeah, for me, I have a lot of questions, more than I do have answers. But yeah, I think I'll leave it here for now. I'd be more interested in the discussion that comes about, because I think the video itself is quite straightforward. It's complex, but straightforward in a sense that it kind of resuscitates Mancoba in my perception from a particular kind of reading, which is located in a Western kind of lens. And here, Abdul, what it does is to really bring it back into African groundedness through ideas of African spirituality, Ubuntu, yeah.
Thank you, Kemang, very much for that. You provided some information as well as we look forward to hearing your questions later. We're now going to watch the film and then the next speaker will speak. So we'll continue from there. The next speaker is Imrubakari. I will introduce him briefly and then we will give him the floor. Are you in the house, Imruh? Yes, I think you are.
Yes.
Okay, welcome. Let me just introduce you and then you can fire away. So Ishaq Imrubakari is a filmmaker and writer. Born in Basseterre and Kitts in the Caribbean, he has lived since the 1960s in the UK and in East Africa. His many film credits include Riots and Rumours of Riots, Street Warrior, The Mark of the Hand, Blue Notes and Exiled Voices, which is familiar to many South Africans, and African Tales. Between 1999 and 2004, he was festival director for the Zanzibar International Film Festival. His books include African Experiences of Cinema, together with Professor Mbai Cham, and 3 poetry collections, Sounds and Echoes, Secret Lives, and With Art Passport or Apology. In 2012, he represented St. Kitts and Nevis at the South Bank Centre's Poetry Parnassus as part of the Cultural Olympiad. He currently teaches film studies at the University of Winchester, and we look forward very much to your input, Imruh. Welcome. Karibu sana, which
Asante sana. Asanteni sana to the family of ArtSat as well. Thank you very much for this invitation. And as you know, I have been attending these sessions over the past weeks. Firstly, I would say to those, who I'm unfamiliar with and, at least familiar with the names over the last few weeks. I would say I have a shared interest with Bridget and Abdulcadir. And also, as I attended the first and second of these sessions, they indeed, for me, became very inspiring and very compelling. I must say this, in a sense, culminated in last week's session, where I was particularly happy to see the sparks that flew between Tembi Nkosi and Athi when their heads clashed, of course. And on reflecting on that with a conversation with Bridget, a few hours later, I spontaneously remarked that I had been waiting 50 years to hear a conversation like that happening. Not so much in terms of the sparks that flew, which, I welcome, and I think both of those brothers would be appreciative of each other's synergy. And I hope they are appreciative of what they are contributing to in terms of the overall thrust of the series. What I was talking about really, what I've been waiting for 50 years in a way, is in a sense, the ideas which have underlined these sessions. Ideas about African art, ideas about knowledge production and its validity, ideas about education and the role or non-role of official academic institutions. And in responding to the film, I think I needed, as it's coming out of that discussion as well with Bridget, to sort of situate myself and my own historical experience in this. My current involvement, I'm a filmmaker, I'm a poet, I'm a writer, but I have a current involvement around archives and museums. I also have a long interest in what I would call hollow things that must fall. And importantly, within the current debates, the importance of the return and restitution of African products, plundered African products, including, ironically, not so ironically, but importantly, human remains to the African continent. So the statement about waiting 50 years is also part of or precipitated by my recent involvement with another webinar series, which I co-curated with the June Giovanni Pan-African Cinema Archive. And we did 4 webinars last year, October, November, around a film called You Hide Me by Kwate Nyowu, a Ghanaian filmmaker. And this film was made in 1970. So the webinar series was designed to celebrate 50 years of this film. In short, this is a documentary that reveals the hidden, or what is hidden in the British Museum in London, in its cellars, in its glass cases. In my introduction, I noted that other than the ethnographic and indeed condescending accounts of African art written by highly regarded Western scholars, if someone wanted to study African art on its own terms at that time, the end of the 60s, 1970, the resources would have been non-existent or virtually non-existent. I was one such person. I entered an art school in 1970. Immediately, I was confronted by the test of sketching nude females in conformity with a rigorous European use of line and perspective. And this notion of line and perspective comes out of Ernest Mancoba's discussions in the film that was shown last week, and of course, his own thinking around his work. I had to do this. I was presented with this task in order to prove my aptitude as an artist. That proved impossible. And I would say it proved impossible due to my engagement, my dialogue with Miles Davis's Bitches Brew, among other releases of the time. But Bitches Brew came out in 1970, an iconic piece of music, suite of music that is still much alive today. Needless to say, what I was faced with was a situation that was designed to render the cultural and artistic knowledge that I had brought to the college with me, to render it as redundant. That too didn't happen. For in fact, my graduation work included a research report, a research proposal, a research dossier on the impact of African art in Europe. And it comprised research that I had done in 1973 in the exact British Museum where You Hide Me was made. It was, however, a few years before I was able to see the film, which gives you an idea of the circumstances many of us, or all of us, were working on at the time. And of course, I was able to meet Kwate Nio a few years later as well. Now, when I introduced the film at the webinar event to mark the 50th anniversary of that film, I pointed out that one resource that I found invaluable at that time, my years at art college, when I entered there in 1970, I left in 1974, 75, was a book called Muntu, an outline of Neo-African culture by Jan Hazen Jan. This book was published in 1961. And of course, please note the title, Muntu, an outline of Neo-African culture. I also noted during that introduction that Walter Rodney's seminal work, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, was not published until 1972. Interestingly, by a Black publisher in London, one of the few Black publishers and pioneers in Black publishing in Britain. I also referred to, and I put it in the chat last week and suggested it as an essential starting point for anyone who was interested in studying African art. But at that time, I referred to it as a seminal, game-changing work by a man called Dennis Williams. He's an artist, he's a Guyanese painter, author, and archaeologist. In 1974, he published a book called Icon and Image, a study of sacred and secular forms of African classical art. Again, noting the title, the thesis is encompassed very succinctly in that title, a study of sacred and secular forms of African classical art. This was published in 1974. I was not able to read this book until about 5 years later. And of course, Dennis Williams had his own challenges. He had worked in the Sudan, taught in the Sudan, did research work in the Sudan. He had also done research work in Nigeria. But from that book, you will see he was unfamiliar with his contemporary, one of his important contemporaries, Cheikh Anta Diop, and his work, which in fact links the cultural unity or articulates the cultural unity of Africa, linking Kemet, Egypt, to the rest of Africa. Important work. Now, in relation to Ernest Mancoba, his work, his generation, and his significance, there is much that I can relate or elaborate in relation to all that was said last week. As an anecdote, however, I want to just briefly give a little story around another artist, Aubrey Williams. No relation to Dennis Williams, except that they come from the same country, Guyana. I happened to make a film on Aubrey Williams in 1986 called The Mark of the Hand. Like Mancoba, Williams was rooted in his homeland. It was, however, a colonial, or you might say colonized territory. As a young man, as a young artist, he finds an impulse to migrate to the metropolitan center. Here he is, inspired and motivated. He seeks fraternity with other artists. So, in effect, why not meet other artists? For example, Picasso, which Williams does. And in my discussions with him over the years in making the film and as a friend, as someone who was learning from him as an older man, passed away in 1990. Yes, 1990. Williams recalls his meeting with Picasso. And he says, and this is recounted in third text, another version of it, or the same said in a different way, but this was said to me, in fact, in our conversation, one of our conversations. Williams said to me, he met, or he wanted to meet Picasso. He met the great man, as he called him. But to his disappointment, Picasso was only interested in his phrenology. In other words, the shape of his head, and whether he, Aubrey Williams, would sit for him as a model. Now that's interesting, isn't it? Here in stark relief, we have the question of African art and its validity. We have the question of the place of African culture and the status of the African artists in Europe and in Africa. Today, I want to suggest that the spectrum of art and cultural production encompasses, as we have seen from the film by Abdulcadir, the art of the moving image. This is not always appreciated by some who I would suggest now pose as authorities on African cinema. However, even in the digital age, we are living in the current, what we call the current digital age. Media institutions are, I would suggest, predisposed towards what I would refer to as a certain nonsense concept. They term, or they refer to something they call content. All the media executives and producers of television, etc., Mnet, all of them. They talk about content, acquiring content. And ironically, in my evaluation, this content is regarded as being it is not necessary to have training. It is only necessary to have training, but not necessarily education. So to produce content, all you need to know is how to use the camera. But that action doesn't need to have any real critical engagement or deep involvement with knowledge. It becomes a sort of spectacle in itself. This brings me to the significance of the short film by Abdulcadir, 6 or 8 minutes long, maybe the shortest thing he has made. And most of his films, I think, are short films. When I look at his past work or recall his past work, for example, Tree of Life, 1988, Seashell, 1992, I want to suggest that this film continues his dialogue, and I stress the word dialogue, with the ancestor. It is, however, a kind of dialogue by which only reading can be made possible or made apparent. Judging and engaging with the quality of this dialogue is what audiences, students, critics, curators will do. And I suggest this would happen at any given historical moment. And by way of this dialogue, or evaluating this dialogue, the signified reading in the Fanonian sense will be articulated, in the sense that each generation in its moment will reveal their own coherence and their worth by the way they read the ancestors. Let's put it in inverted commas. So, in conclusion, for now, of course, I'll be looking forward to the discussion. This brings me to what I would want to discuss in terms of the task of modern African art, as opposed to what is termed traditional modern art. And the way in which we might move beyond the fetish and the commodity, whether that is for curios, for tourists, or an art market, towards more substantial materials of new knowledge and new perceptions that authenticate the African human condition and its historical reality. Now, this is one critical reason why I would suggest the return and restitution of Africa's plundered heritage is non-negotiable. Without these works, without this archive, the potential for dialogue and the apparent reading or readings is circumscribed unnecessarily. So to end, I want to end with a quote that may respond in a way, at least provisionally, to both Mancoba as one of the subjects of today's discussion, and to Reading the Ancestor, the film, the other of today's discussions. These quote a few lines from one of Africa's great poets, Christopher Okebo, Nigerian. And it's taken from his collection, Labyrinths, which was published in 1971. In one of the poems, it's called Lament for Silent Sisters, Lament for the Silent Sisters. He writes, "We carry in our worlds that flourish or worlds that have failed." Now, without reading the rest of the poem, it's important to note that counter to the preoccupation of the poem itself, because the poem is actually dealing with the tragedy of the Nigerian Civil War between 1967 and 70. I want to suggest, well, counter to the logic of those lines within the poem, taking them out of the poem and reading them or contextualizing them in terms of reading the ancestor. They seem to say that this is not, for example, a swan song, as the poem goes on to talk. It is not a doomsday situation, but what we are addressing here is the very essence of Ubuntu. Ubuntu in our time. And I would want to suggest that our time, which we will have to account for in the Fanonian sense, in a way, is a time of reconstruction. And I hope that sort of encompasses some of the ideas that this film, Moving Art of the Moving Image, has evoked around my head. Those are the sparks that's been flying around my head for a few days. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Imruh. That was rich and erudite and deeply informative. And thank you very much for bringing the diaspora question in, because that's really important. We're going to show the film again, but if I could add 2 comments, if I may, from the chair, just that were inspired in a way by what Imruh said, and which will link to the next speaker, Mgcineni Sobopha. One of the things, Ernest Mancoba spoke to me about Picasso as well, we won't go into that now, but one of the things he said that was very, very powerful about the Cubists in general, he said they took the form of African art, but they didn't take the spiritual content. And what he really meant by that was the question of Ubuntu. And it's so beautiful because the way Imruh has ended is also the way in which Pro is going to start, because Pro is going to talk to us about the meaning of the ancestor in Ernest Mancoba's work and the meaning of the ancestor in general in our lives. And the other thing that Ernest Mancoba said to me, he said, the African religion is a religion of the unknown, and that's part of the problem. And so again, we have the opportunity to hear Pro, I'll give you his nickname, speak, and I really look forward to that. But just before he does, we're going to show the film one more time for people who came late and didn't get a chance to see it, and also to allow people an opportunity to reflect on it. So Malik's going to show it one more time, and then I'll introduce Pro, and we can carry on from there. And it's now my great pleasure to introduce Mgcineni Pro Sobopha. He is an artist and writer, and he currently lectures in history of art and practice at the University of Fort Hare, Ernest Mancoba's alma mater, fine arts school. He holds fine arts degrees and a master's degree in fine arts, both from the University of Cape Town, where he also taught drawing, painting, theory, and discourse of art. He writes on contemporary South African art. His essays have appeared in Nka, Arthrub, Art South Africa, Agenda, Empowering Women for Gender Equity Journal, and Visual Century, South African Art in Context, Volume 4. He has been included in numerous national and international exhibitions and participated in various conferences, national and international. And we particularly look forward to hearing him speak about the ancestor and the ancestral world. Thank you, Pro, and welcome. Your volume could be a little bit better. I think if you come closer to the mic, that will be better.
Let me do that. Can you hear me now?
That's wonderful, Pro. Fantastic. Go ahead.
Okay. As you've just introduced me, I'm the person that you know you just met many years ago. Good friendship, interesting relationships in terms of rewriting the history of what African art is, what contemporary African art is, which is so interesting for me every day when I wake up. As you can see, actually, maybe behind me, I've just turned this house to a gallery. It's the first one of its kind in Alice, because the De Beers Contemporary Art Gallery that hosts the best collection of Black South African artists. It's a kind of a white elephant. So for me, it's an honor to have this platform to say some of the things that have been troubling me or concerning me. Thanks, Abdul, for reflecting or reconstructing or reimagining the ancestor. It's so wonderful. And I think for me, what's so interesting about it, when it starts, the film itself, It's that umngqongqo necrosa terms. Umngqongqo. It's one of those moments when people actually really enjoy themselves and reflect back to their roots. And that means if you don't have a roots, you don't belong anywhere. So the ancestor, for me, is the kind of the key to our thinking, to our living, to be what we are. So hence, I think Ernest Mancoba find himself to have to go back and dig the roots and hold on to those roots, and he created the ancestor, because the ancestor is what we are, where we come from, and where are we going. And it's a key again. How do we reimagine the world? Because the world is supposed to belong to everyone. And how, referring to Abdul's, reconstruction or deconstruction of that ancestor image that Mancoba painted, it brings us back to how colonization have actually, in different ways, manipulated to colonize, free. The victors always name places by their names. For instance, Alice. Who's Alice? Local people know it as Etiquette. What is King Williamstown? King Williamstown got Abdul. So happened that one of the daughters of the queen settled there. Then what comes Abdul. In a sense that I think Mancoba's yearning in another world of some sense, I would say. He was missing what he thought he belonged to, but also there was a yearning to belong to humanity.
Troy, could you speak a little louder? Sorry.
Oh, sorry. I'm getting... So I think Ernest Mancoba, when he left South Africa to go into exile, he wanted to have some kind of a real engagement, a good engagement, a productive engagement with humanity, regardless of color. So the ancestor becomes the key for his happiness, in a sense, to belong somewhere, because he found himself lost in the midst of nowhere. So I think the ancestor speaks a lot, not to only to Mancoba, but to all of us, because Mancoba's yearning was to engage the world in an equal footage. We are people because of other people. There can't be any tree without the roots. So the ancestor becomes the roots of what being. So I would suggest, I'm not actually suggesting, my thinking is that for everyone in the world, they should belong in that humanity. For humanity, the thinking. So that we don't say, I see a Guadalajara like Abdul next to me. I don't see Bridget like anybody else. Like everyone around there, we are people because of being people. So I think the importance of the ancestor links us all, because we're coming from the same root. Whether we're coming from west, east, north, down, south, everywhere, we are humans. And we have to treat everyone like humans. So Ernest Mancoba actually made it sure that to be rooted, we have to hold on to the ancestor, and of which I think we should be doing every day, not just bypassing things, because the relative that for me to be me, I need you. For you to be you, you need me. So humanity is very important, and humanism, we treat each other in a really respectful manner, regardless of what do I have, what do you have, and all this kind of stuff. But I don't want to be long about talking about the ancestor. But what I would actually suggest, the synopsis of the article that I wrote can be published, or people might read it even now, and then we can engage on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pro. That was very beautiful and profound, and a clear explanation of how the ancestor links all of us in the world in the name of all humanity. And we certainly will be publishing your article on the ancestor, both the long version and the short version, very soon. So they will be available, and I hope that they will allow for greater discussion. Thank you, I'm very touched. I'd also like to mention that last week we had the great pleasure of having Ernest Mancoba's very good friend with us, and we have him again today. Elaine Spielman, welcome. Thank you very much for being with us again. It's really good to have you. And now it is my delight to introduce Thando Mama, who is a colleague of Pro at the University of Fort Hare. Thando Mama, and he will be raising questions for the speakers. Thando Mama is an artist and lecturer in visual art literature, graphics and printmaking at the University of Fort Hare. He works mainly in new media, photography, video art and installation art. He has worked as an exhibition designer at the Robben Island Museum and as an independent curator and manager. And we look forward to the challenges you're going to pose us, Thando. Welcome.
Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you can see me and hear me. Thanks.
Yes, we can see you and hear you.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Bridget and your team for the invitation for this platform, and also of keeping Untitled Mancoba's legacy alive, most especially for us that actually engage with young artists that are coming up, and that needs to be actually be kind of engaged with. I will kind of, I know that I've been given like kind of a brief to cover 2 questions, but I'll have general comments and then a couple of questions. So I'll be short as possible. Just to start off maybe with Pro's presentation, which for me also brought something that I have been thinking about, particularly looking at the short film we've been looking at. When Pro mentioned something like about us connecting to the root, and in fact, for me, it kind of almost linking the Ancestor by Mancoba to the prehistorical kind of cultures. One, when we think about rock art or rock painting, you know, not only in Southern Africa, but throughout the world, you know, we find almost a common ancestor kind of being kind of manifest in those of paintings, perhaps in a way, that is my thinking, perhaps that will be a broad question for all presenters to look at how Mancoba connects to the source of being human, to the roots, and also to try to keep that Ubuntu that he went to France with and lived for so many years, kind of almost longing for the return home to connect with his ancestors in a way. This invitation as well made me to rewatch, I think, Bridget, your short documentary on Mancoba when he was coming back home. The film started off with Mancoba looking at the screen in his honor, and the national anthem is being sung, which actually for me connects with this video, how it starts with with Umhobo and other instruments, but also in the same time feels a bit, what you call it, kind of unsettling nature in a way, because the artists have interpreted Mancoba's life through the century, really, you know, and also the upheaval that was happening whilst he was in exile. I think my broad questions, perhaps when Kemang was saying he has more questions than answers in his presentation, will be this interesting interpretation of Mancoba's the Ancestor through this medium, the videography, film, have some interesting kind of historical kind of acknowledgement. However, how would you engage with this work to reach the core essence and the initial message carried by Mancoba? So that is kind of a broad question. Any speaker could actually respond to that question. Anyone can respond to that question. Maybe it was.
Yes. Thank you, Thando. Is that your last question? Do you have any more questions?
Okay. And then anyway, I was hoping in a way, I'm not sure, Bridget, I was hoping the artists as well, in a way, could be brought into this discussion. I know that you have the presenters that actually was looking at this kind of particular work, but as an artist as well, I think the second question would be towards the artist as well. Because the question that I had with me was that the collaborative nature of the work, you know. Can you as an artist in a way put yourself in Mancoba's shoe to say, here's my work, do as you please with it, you know? Because for me, I look at Mancoba as an artist that was not boxed, you know, that could actually bring in kind of new blood to interpret this work. This is kind of my assumption of Mancoba. But in a way, his approach into the creation of work, the production of work, he's even thinking about his work as well, could have actually allowed that kind of collaboration with him. I know he collaborated with his wife, but I'm just like thinking now, the younger generation, because we talking about Mancoba's legacy in a way. So I'll bring in the artist in terms of the collaboration and the freedom to almost tear down his work and put it back again in a way. Yeah, so I'll stop there.
Thank you, Tando, for the insightful comments and also for the very thoughtful questions. I can see the speakers are ready to rock and roll and to respond to your first question, which, if I understand it correctly, it's how would you read this message of the ancestor? And I think let's go in the order in which the speakers spoke. So Kemang, if you could start, and then Imruh, and then Pro, and then we'll come to the second question. Thank you very much, Tando, for getting the conversation started.
Okay, Tando, if I understood correctly, you were speaking about Abdul's interpretation of the or reimagining of the work through video form, obviously, because this is a painting which he has animated. So there's a stretch between art forms here. But for me, I wanted to speak about, in fact, because I have another screen opened here of the video halfway through. And in fact, the way that you are sitting and the background and like your attire, it almost looks like, I wish you could see what I see.
Yeah.
It looks like you could be part of the painting as well. And this is obviously because of the colors that are there. And I think it's interesting here, like the essence, if one speaks about it, because, and of course, with Abdul's work, if one is tracing it, there was a mention of a film that he made called, I think it's called Tree. And then if you also look at the image or the figure in the painting, how it becomes erased, it's almost like a sweeping or a carpet of brush strokes that are disappearing. But for me, the interesting thing is how Abdul reimagines and brings it back. It's almost as if to trace his steps, right? But I think one important thing I wanted to, or I'd forgotten to mention initially, was for me, when I first saw the video, I read it in two ways, right? It's about the history of colonialism and the erasure of African culture generally. But also there's another form of erasure here at play, which we know, I think, which is about Ernest Mancoba's role in the European movement and his erasure from the larger discourse generally. But the interesting thing for me is how when Abdul retraces the image, not only referencing the African sculptures, but also the image almost reappears initially as a tree as well. And also obviously like the hues that are used in the painting itself and how they get swept off the canvas, the brush strokes in the video. As I said, initially almost suggested like there were leaves being blown away by wind. Oh. screen changed. Yeah, I think in the video, obviously, like again, we see there are birds that appear in flight. And obviously this is, I read as a reference to the artist himself, Ernest, and him like leaving South Africa for Europe to find freedom and belonging. Because in one interview, he actually says that he realized he couldn't become an artist here because he was being told what to make and he didn't want to be boxed, and therefore he desired something beyond, something spiritual, something more human, I guess, which is what the core of my reading of the work is. It's about an expression of a desire for humanity, or to be human.
Thank you. Is anything else? Okay, I see you've muted. Imruh, if you could also respond to the question.
Yes, I'll try. There are a number of things knocking around. One is, and let me speak firstly from the point of view of a filmmaker. And as I said, I've made a film about artists. I have an interest in fine art. I've curated, exhibitions and various things. But I want to link this to Mancoba's statement of a heritage of trial and error. Now, for me, that doesn't mean something accidental or something waiting to happen. That seems to suggest something that another filmmaker who has influenced my work talked about, Andrei Tarkovsky, a Russian filmmaker, who talks about the natural imperfection of any work. It is not about perfection, it's about making a statement, and the statement is part of an ongoing process. So we are not trying to establish something definitively perfect, but to make a statement or to engage with the realities and the emotions of a moment, as it were. So trial and error is saying to us, we don't have to feel guilty about something that might be termed a mistake or naive, or, a critic might engage in very different ways, because that is part of the process of human production, okay? So that's one. The other issue is, my experience tells me that once you place a camera in front of a work of art, it becomes something else. Where you see a work of art changes its meaning and how you perceive it. Art galleries are very different. If you exhibit something in the street or in a shopping center, it looks different. It has a different kind of signification, let's put it that way. People who run art galleries tell you about, or painters tell you about the light in an art gallery, right? So every context changes the work of art. And that's the beauty of it. That's the trial and error, because every time we place it somewhere, it's going to confront the essential humanness of the person who is engaging with it, right? So that brings me to this thing about interpreting. And I want to suggest that my own approach is not about interpreting, but in engaging in a dialogue. I use this term dialogue, and I'm suggesting that it is only through dialogue that reading can become apparent, right? And I base that on the fact that we at some time in the future are going to be ancestors. At some time in the future, we are going to be ancestors, right? So we don't want people in 100 years trying to interpret what we did. We want them to dialogue with what we did as manifesting our moment and taking it forward into this stream of human existence, which colonialism has sought to dislocate African people from. And that is the violence of colonialism. That is the violence of colonial plunder. And that is the violence of the status quo that exists today, that African people generally have, and colonized people have been dislocated and marginalized from being valid participants in the human experience, right? Mancoba's work and others is, a way of recuperating and challenging that issue. And we are, in a way, continuing that legacy. So that's something I'd like to just think about for now, in response to the questions, and maybe I'll get some more thoughts as we go along. Yeah.
Thank you, Imruh. That was a very good way to start. Just before the hand up, could we allow Pro to speak, or Pro, would you allow Abdulcadir to speak before you?
I would rather actually speak before Abdulcadir.
Okay, you go first. Fantastic, Pro. Thank you. Go right ahead. And just remember to speak loudly towards your mic. Thank you.
I'm trying to get it closer. From the two speakers before, I've just realized there's a lot that we share, and of which I think is the relate about ourselves. One, I would love to actually maybe pose another question, not a really question, a comment on Kemang, which is so interesting for me about the ancestor. Kemang, you went to Google it, and as an archaeologist, in a sense, when you start to peel down all those paints and the layers of revealing or revelations of what Gladys Mgcineni was, which was so great for me to see. That's one. Two is that Bakari is saying something about a really, really interesting thing that relates to the location of culture by Homi Bhabha. Where do we really find the gray line? And the gray line, I think, belongs to humanity, because humanity is not negative, it's not positive. So for me, I don't want to dwell too much, but I just want to quote something, a song from the late Hugh Masekela. And he says, open up the doors, Mamandoro. And in most cases, people go to shebeens and they think it's just a space of being a drunkard or whatever they can call it. But it's a space of conversation, of that dialogue that Bakari speaks about. So we need more spaces like that, not in the sense of a shebeen, people would think. People go to shebeen to drink. Some people don't even drink there. They just go there to have a dialogue. So let the dialogue continue. Thank you.
Thank you too, Pro. One of the things Mancoba said was, we need exchange, we need a dialogue. He agreed with you 100%. I'd like to now go to Tando's second question, and thank you all three of you for your contributions. And the second question, Tando, if I'm summarizing it correctly, was that you would like the artist, the filmmaker, to respond on the collaborative nature of the work. Is that correct?
Yes,
Okay.
that's correct, Richard.
Okay. Abdulkadir, can I give the floor to you?
Appreciated that. Thank you to everyone who participated in this discussion and presentation. And beautiful words of appreciation of the work itself and the question raised by the work itself. But everything has to have a meaning, and everything has a process where it started and everything this. So to tell you the honest truth, when I was doing this, it was video art and everything, but I said, how in order to be truthful to what you are doing, I went through all the transcript that Bridget Thompson did the interview with Mancoba when she made that film, the short film that you saw. But the transcript material is huge and it covers a lot of other aspects, dimensions and everything. He talks about his personal view, he talks about his feelings, he talks about history, he talks about how he felt and what he feels about the art and everything. And at the end, the most important thing, I realized one thing, that through that interview, reading through that material, which is, it's not a simple material, but it's a large material, amount of material, which hasn't, that it was transcribed, but wasn't edited yet. To make another film about Mancoba, but not only Mancoba at home, but the funny thing that, to tell you the honest truth, it says, it tells the story that when he left South Africa, he went to a boat on a ship. The ship was named Alone. And he ended the port not knowing where he's going to be. He went directly to a pub and he sat with the people there and they start talking about being alone and all these things. And one of the sailors said, I'm alone. And Mancoba said, I'm alone too. And the ship who brought them to England was alone. They felt alone and he was all alone. So I edited a small film calling about All Alone. What do you call it? A 40-minute film that, but we never finalized that film. But it's a form of where he expresses everything. And one of the important things that I want to come back to the process of making this, I realized one thing which is very important. When Mancoba speaks, he says one word, but it's not only one word, it's a word that has an entire meaning and needs to be decoded. And when you see the sentence, if you split the sentence, each word of the sentence has a meaning on its own. And that was the most important thing to decode. The other thing is the question that came to my mind. Among the different paintings that Mancoba did, about 40 or 50, 60, something, I don't know, only 3 he gave it the name. Ancestor is one. The other one is about when his wife died, and it took another couple of years to make it. Well, this painting, it took 3 years to make, from 69 to 71. And the other one is 1976. And I questioned myself, why it took so long for this painting? Then secondly, why he named it the ancestor, the ancestor. What that mean, ancestor? So that is the question that came to my mind. Then I started looking at the painting and decoding the images that are visible. And that came to my mind that they said Mancoba, it was the European, they don't like this, and the Western, they don't like this, but it's a reality. They can negate to their art content, but they cannot change the history and reality. Mancoba did the first thing that in art is called, what do you call it, expressionism, what do you call it, minimal, correct me, Bridget, minimal expressionism, or what's that?
You mean abstract expressionism, what Rashid Harain said he did, yeah.
The abstract expressionism, going back to, is a form where the African art people, they did that on the painting of the murals, rock painting, what they call it. And it's not nothing new that the Western world tried to negate, but something else like that. What is that he did that? And you can see it in the painting that he included himself in the painting, that he paints the ancestor himself. And you see the history of South Africa, where the ancestral figure is the collective, the country, everything. So that is where I like Professor, what do you call it, Sobopha, when he says it's the root that connects everyone. It's the country, it's Africa. It's not only proudly South Africa, but it's Africa itself, the Kwere land, whatever it is. So it's a broad concept. And it's the mankind of humanity and everything starts. Then the important thing is one thing which is very important that struck me, that he says, African art is there, but there is no one who speaks on behalf of the African art. So you can find the African art in everywhere, but you hardly find someone who speaks on behalf of the African art. So that is what propelled me to deconstruct the painting, and everything is there. I didn't add anything else. What I did is only, now we see the painting, okay, it's not deconstructing or reconstructing, it's a kind, let's repaint again together. And to start with the grandmother and the mother, when he speaks about that he left his grandmother, they left his grandmother behind. And when you leave an old person behind, naturally dies. And when she dies, she becomes integral part of the ancestor, which is already there in the painting. Then we see the beauty, what do you call it, the not illusional beauty, but there is the conflict that was going on in Africa and the arrival of the, what do you call it, the foreign and the, what do you call it, prospectors, the digging of the gold, the red violence, is the history of South Africa. But in this, directly, it represents also the history of the continent, which is the colonial history, which Imruh explained that. It's not disconnected, it's interconnected among everything. And at the end, everything explodes. So the question is, when he says is a collective experience that everything we have to keep and we have to find is a trial and error. Life itself is a trial and error. It's not the trial of reading the previous one. The previous one itself felt about that. And one of the important things that I remember when we were together in Paris, I asked him about racism. That 90-year-old man was holding my hand. But when I mentioned racism, his hand became so powerful that he almost squeezed my bones. And he said, man, we will talk separately. We will talk separately, me and you, about racism. So I said, okay, fine. But I felt that I touched a wound. But indirectly, he politely and diplomatically said to me, you see, one of the things that we have to do is that man makes mistakes, but the important thing that he learns about his mistakes. But if he hasn't learned from his mistakes, it will repeat. And it reminded me the classical Latin proverb who says, Historia magistra vitae. So history is the teacher of life, but at that de facto, history hasn't taught mankind. The only thing that mankind hasn't learned is from history, and he will always repeat himself. That is the background, what propelled me to make reading the Ancestor. And it's, what do you call it? And one important thing that guided me, it was him when he said, my artwork is Freudian. Whatever is in my mind, I will put there. And when he starts speaking to me, I will stop. And then I realized that what is inside his mind is about his people and his country. But not his people as proudly South African, but his people as the whole continent and the whole people. That is what represents it. I hope that I will give a glimpse of the background explanation for why I did that. And I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Abdulcadir. I'd like to, we've gone on for a little bit of time, and I'd like to open the discussion to everybody if there are any other questions that anybody would like to ask. There aren't any in the chat. I was giving a running commentary on the pictures in the chat, but is there anybody who would like to raise their hand who has a question to any of the speakers, to Abdulcadir, to Tandor? Or even a comment? We would welcome your comments, your thoughts. Shepi, would you like to say anything? Ah, Sibonga Konke, welcome. Please unmute yourself and go for it. And we'd like to see your face as well, if you don't.
Hi, I'd show my face if I could. I'm just not in the position to right now, excuse me. The question's for Abdulcadir. I'm just curious as to the use of sound in the film. I found that sound is rather dominant, especially juxtaposed with what looks like, I would say, small imagery or small etchings in his film. So I was just curious as to the choices around the usage of sound and why the decision to have the sound so dominant as compared to the etchings in his conversation with Mancoba's artwork. Of course, I do acknowledge that there's a stirring stillness in these small images that comes across quite to be a bit loud, but one can't avoid how dominant the audio is, and I just wondered what informed that decision.
Before Abdulcadir, is there anybody else who'd like to ask Abdulcadir questions about the film or comment on the sound, and then I'll let Abdulcadir respond? Thank you.
So I just wanted to pick up on something that was mentioned here about the fact that we're watching a film of which obviously takes its cue from a painting, and there was a mention about the importance of realizing that this is a film and it operates differently to how it's viewed in galleries or museums or in any other space that it might be shown. So I had the question for Abdul, asking originally, how was the film screened? Because now because of the pandemic, we are viewing the film on our screens individually, whereas previously, this is where my question is coming from, is how was this film initially screened? Also, when you were making the film, did you have an idea of how it would be screened or filmed?
Thanks, Kemang. Any other questions about the film itself that we can pose to Abdulcadir? Nobody else is putting their hand up. So Abdulcadir, fire away and please answer Sibonga.
Thank you for the questions. I will start with the simple one. The film is not a film, it's a video art, first and foremost. It's presented in a form of video. What we did is that we had at the 2006, the exhibition of Gold of Africa Museum, where Mancoba worked and African spirituality, where Bridget was saying. We had the painting, and next to it, we had, what do you call it, a screen in the same format and the same measurement of the painting. So this abstract art that Mancoba did, the people could not understand it. So it was a kind of a introduction or reading the ancestor. So that is the video artist name, it reading the ancestor, where it looped next to the painting of the museum where the people started. And to give you an example, that was the first intention, and it was there for all the months that the exhibition was there. The first part was that is a video art. Number two, coming back to the question of that young lady, Sibang, Sibonka Konke. The audio film, with your visual and audio is complementary. But although it's not something that comes into a format where the image comes predominantly separated from the context, in the general context, the painting is one thing. I cannot zoom in. I had the painting there, and it's a small thing that I have to reveal. It was about 2,600 layers of a digital layer, while we separate the painting in layers and digital layers, 2,600 layers, and we try to emulate the painter itself in his hand and all these things, and then color it. So although we were revealing one by one, the etching, what you call it, we cannot go into a full screen as a level sound or parallel to it. And the sound is 50% of the explanation. Why? If we have done without sound, the people could not understood or could not have understood, but at least to animate or to give a sense of orientation. Why? When you combine visual and audio together, you have a meaning, something that makes a sense or a meaning, an interpretation. It gives you the impression that it's high. Why? It's violent, but it goes crescendo. What do you call it? The one thing that when the gun starts shouting and the gun starts firing, that is become violent, and the first part is higher. Then at the end, reduces it and it blows up, and that is where Mancoba comes in with his voice. But it's a complementary thing, and it gives a sense of emotional sense. I hope that I answered that thing, unless there is no other thing.
There's something, Abdulka, I would like to just add in what you've said. When talks about volume, you just mentioned the violence. There's an element, consciously or unreflectively, that somewhat the rethinking and the reanimation of the film at the level of visual, as the sound is there, it also violates the image. There's something violent, not only about this experience of being black in the world, but also the actual visual, as the sound comes in, violates Mancoba's creative production as a work of art. What you make of that as a reading, among many other readings, because you are quite right, the violence is there. And the violence is not only that which is experienced in the world, but the violation of the actual painting itself in that process of, whether you call it deconstructing, reconstructing, or what Bakari was talking about, this natural imperfection of art. That imperfection is a form of violence to the actual image. And this classic painting, what do you make of that kind of reading?
Can I add something, or Abdulkadir, do you want to answer that? I just wanted to add something that for me, the soundtrack has always been in the director's storytelling. It's been the strongest element of the director's storytelling. And there's a filmmaker who says, the eye sees, but the ear imagines. But just to allow you, Abdulkadir, to reply to Tembe Nkosi's very, very interesting question.
Okay, thank you for the question, Tembe Nkosi. You see, what do you call it? Mancoba is a painter with the reflex, is not a subject. He's a humanist, although humanism originated in Africa, but in the same time, he tells you what he says to you, I present whatever is in my Freudian way, whatever is in my subconscious. And when he tells the story of his own country and the whole continent of Africa, the exploitation, the racism, the protest, the repression, and all these things, he didn't do it in a subtle way. He did in a very articulated manner. When you read that, depends on you if you take the soft approach, or depends on you reading. But I don't think that I have violated him, or I have, or what do you call it, brought something violent on him. No. I read what he did that according to my own personal reading. and according to the reading, which is an historical fact, which is there. Depends if someone brings a flower and he says, our past history of South Africa is roses and flowers and petals and there is no violence. It's up to that person to do it. But I reflected whatever it was there and whatever is historical reality there. So I don't see how I violated Mancoba expression or artistical expression. I would like you to define that thing and articulate for me. I will appreciate that.
Let me try. It's such a basic visual analysis. What I see and what I hear, the simultaneous working of this reconstruction or reimagining. This is what I'm reading. I'm not reading the context out. I completely agree that the experience of being Black in the world is a violent one. And I was happy that Bakari brought the notion of wartime. But what I'm saying is also creative processes, they can also be violent. Language also can be violent to an extent that while we are speaking of violence, we are also violating the very same object or subject we are talking to or about. So that's why it was a question of an observation, not to say you are doing that. I'm interested because unless I were to see it and think it through, then I'll be able to tell you that, to say, in all of the context you are giving, the references based on Mancoba's own words, experiences, and the many others we know. But at the level of visual, exactly what Bonga was pointing out, as far as the noise, let's forget now about the sound, the machine guns, the toy, and all of that. Those are sounds of violence. But the way in which the animation itself, the pixelation, when you see it leaves the painting, that's what I mean. This so-called decollaging the painting or deconstructing, it's a form of violence at the level of visual, given that we know the painting. So what I'm saying is, it was that, you don't need to answer. It was just a comment of an observation of one kind. I like also what Bakari said about away from interpretation. I'm not entering to interpret. This is a dialogue, meaning that I can take a position because of where I'm looking at and how I'm responding to at the level of sensory level, both visually as well as auditory. So it is that I'm asking, because as much as all that is said and done, which is all important, I agree, but there's this element that seems to be repressed. Now that we are on the level, on the notion of the subconscious, Mancoba himself, he says he allows that subconscious to come up, or the unconscious, and we know the unconscious is always the repressed, and most of what is repressed is violence. And when it surfaces, it comes with a certain voodoo, a certain force. So what I'm saying is, that's one way of reading as a dialogue. This is not to say it's all and all. It was just a comment without making us a dialogue. It was just to think as I was listening to Sibonga Gongo and also your response. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, I missed you. Thank you.
Any more questions to Abdulcadir, or any more general questions that anybody would like to raise to any of the speakers? That was a very, very interesting exchange, very thoughtful exchange. Anybody who'd like to add anything, any comments, questions? Just having a look to see if any hands are up. Nothing for the moment. Well, then I'd like to ask all the speakers if they'd like to, and Tando, if they'd like to make one last comment before we close. Starting with you, Kemang, is there any last comment you'd like to make?
Maybe my comment will be basically from Professor Salah Hassan, essay African Modernism Beyond Alternative Modernities Discourse, where he asked, why should Mancoba's life and his artistic accomplishments be instructive in exploring African modernity and modernism. I believe this is a continuation of that discourse and discussions, even going back to Rashad Arian's kind of edge for African art historians to relook and be serious in terms of positioning Mancoba. For me, I think I will as a participant in a way in this discussion, I will kind of leave it with that kind of comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Tando. Any of the other speakers like to raise a last point? Kemang?
Sorry? Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, Imruh, we can hear you.
Okay, fine. Yeah. I just wanted to, I just wanted to conclude in a way and bring some things together in my own head. And really what we've been sort of engaging with is a really deep and so important. It's really about coming back to something that's been said about all of these discussions, and it relates to the issues of education and learning. How do we teach African art? How do we learn African art? And how do we critique African art? In other words, how do we validate it as part of our modernity? And I say, I'm talking about African modernity in a very specific sense, given the kind of global configuration in which we are sort of contesting in a way. This notion of the traditional and the modern, this notion of the sacred and the secular, to draw on Dennis Williams's, approach to African art, its understanding and its historiography, and where we place works like the Ancestor, Ernest Mancoba, his work, where do we place that and how do we really engage with it? Today, as I said, we're living in the digital age. Video art, moving image are all part of the new materials that we have. And it has its own challenge, but once we understand where we are grounded and the aspects of the tools that we have, I don't see that as particularly problematic. It's a way of really formulating a coherent way of bringing minds and new minds into the frame of reference that we sort of, in a way, trying to figure out, and what was said earlier, Thembi Nkosi, again, we return to that notion of what we are trying to, he used the word violating, but I don't think it was necessarily, it was a way of saying this is part of the imperfection of what a contemporary artist after Mancoba will have to do or will be able to do. These are the possibilities of the present that speaks to this moment, that speaks to our moment. And for me, that's very, very important to be able to place myself as an artist and to relate to others as in this framework. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Imruh. Pro, are you still with us? Let me just have a look. Would you like to say anything? Kemang, you haven't said you wanted to say anything, so I'm skipping you and carrying on to Pro, but if you'd like to, Kemang, you're welcome. But Pro, I think you're ready to say something. You need to unmute your mic. You need to unmute your mic. The bottom left-hand side of your screen, just release it. We can't hear you, Pro. Can you unmute your mic? Pro, we can't hear you. Can you unmute your mic? Pro, can you unmute your mic? Or Malik, can you do it for us?
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Hello?
yes, fantastic. At last.
I'm back on the screen.
Can
No,
you
it's
start
just a
again from the
comment.
beginning?
No, I can't go back. It's just a comment. I would like to actually not really pose a question and think about this construction and reconstruction and recovery. And I would love if Kemang will talk about that in relation to the film, because what Lehulere did for me is more similar to what Abdul did about the ancestor. So can you relate, or could they relate in that sense of reconstructing or remaking? Thank you.
Thank you, Pro. Are you ready to go for it, Kemang?
You asking me to speak about the reconstruction? Hello?
Yebu.
Okay. I mean, like as Mgcineni said, the sound, there's a lot of violence. Also, there's like instruments, which are both, and for me, this speaks to African spirituality, but also the use of a trumpet in the film is also an expression of Mancoba's. I mean, of course, we know he was dislocated, but he moved to Europe, and then obviously he engages with Europe, and then I don't want to say he didn't encounter like a trumpet or any other Western instruments here, but I find it interesting that these two traditional, I mean, African, this Xhosa specifically instrument, I didn't know actually what it was called until last night or this morning now. In fact, I'd gotten it wrong. But I think for me, there's an interesting convergence of Mancoba's experience and journey in life from leaving the continent to Europe. And of course, it's expressed through what Mgcineni might have termed as violence in terms of how language can be violent, so imagery in terms of how they are constructed or deconstructed or reconstructed, in fact, which is what I myself, when I did work with Mancoba, I made a video. Excuse me?
With the Gladys Mgulandu's house, when you excavated it.
Well, there's that, the Mgcineni house, where it was a peeling of layers of paint, which was a peeling of 9 layers of paint and 2 layers of plaster. So it was an uncovering of sorts, an unearthing. But obviously, I mean, I read the film in a similar kind of way because except
so
that
how do you relate that?
It's in
excuse me. How would you relate that in relation to Mgcineni's issues of violence, and how violent what is like when you have all those carving tools? And
look, I mean, I think for me, yes, the process of, because I had to, firstly, we had to peel through a number of layers of paint, but that was a very delicate process. One had to be very gentle in terms of, because these were layers of paint that had been come together over many years, number one. Number two, there were 2 layers of plaster before we got to the actual painting. But by the time the arrival of the painting, which is an image of a bird, by the time I arrive at the image, because the process itself was not, it's a messy process. So the image could not be recovered fully as what it used to be. But in this case, obviously, Abdulcadir, what it does is he starts with the image, erases it, and then reconstructs it as a way of understanding its roots and its meaning, or bringing it back to life in a way, so to speak.
So then you agree there's violence in the making.
Oh,
you agree there's violence in the...
But I'm asking, do you agree? Is there violence in the making?
Of the work?
Of the making.
Well, you mentioned 2 things here. You mentioned Mgcineni. You mentioned my work with Ernest Mgcineni.
In relation to Temigos's question of violence.
In this video.
How do you relate to the video of Abdul erasing the image and reconstructing it, and you excavating, that is Mgcineni peeling down all those layers? Isn't there similarities there?
Well, so there are two things here. One, my process was a very physical process, right? So I'm working on an actual wall, whereas this is a digital process that we're dealing with. So whether one can say, of course, symbolically, yes, there is violence.
Welcome.
But I mean, from a discourse of aesthetics of violence, one can argue, but also there is a reconstruction of the image, which is, in actual fact, for me, I find it, which is why in the beginning I said it was a resuscitation, actually, of not only maybe Mancoba's work and its discourse, but of how the work can be read and understood.
Would you agree then, if you can read Patrice Lumumba, returning to the source, what's the difference?
What's the difference between what?
Returning to the source, what Abdul done and what you've done. Ain't we trying to return to the cause or the source?
Yeah, I think they're both, it's the same thing.
Thank you.
Hello, can I intervene?
Yeah, I think we need to move towards wrapping up. I think Pro did get the answer to the question that he wanted. Kemang, have you said everything you'd like to say? And then I'll ask Abdulcadir, and then I'm going to wrap up.
Well, I think there are 2 things here. So last night, I had to watch the film a number of times. And I watched it initially with sound repeatedly, and then I watched it also without sound, which is coming back to Sibonga Konke's comment on the sound being so dominant. So I wanted to see how the work reads if I watch the video without the sound, because also I'm a visual artist, right? I have to, I think very visually. Excuse me. So for me, Usbonga Wonge said that the sound is quite dominant, and it is, I agree, but that a number of sounds involved, or it's a complex mixture of sounds in the work itself. So for me, yes, there is and there isn't in that sense, because there's sounds of nature as well, right? There's a sound of wind, there's sound of lightning, there is sound of various number of sounds, but also in the process now of the image making itself, right? One can read it as violent, or one can read it as, it was, somebody responded in the comments. They said that it was also reconstruction. And of course, one, if you think now, if you relate it back to the work that you're speaking about on a pro, about the Gudlandli work that I made, it was an unearthing of sorts. It was but also was a chance to discover. It was a peeling of layers of paint, but at the same time, I can't say that it was a violent process, because it was very delicate. But of course, the final image looked very violent because of the nature of what it was.
I think we've been slightly distracted by this word violence, because in fact, Thembinkosi used the word violate, which isn't exactly the same as violence. There's a question in the chat, which is, with respect, I found Sobopha's question to Kemang about his recovery of Dada's work as violence. Is he saying that conservation, which is what Kemang is doing, is violence? Is the question being a willful misreading or being provocative? Anyway, it's not an important question, just find it confusing. So I'd like to just give my take on how I thought the conversation between Pro and Kemang concluded. I thought it concluded with Pro being very satisfied that Kemang saw a similar process of returning to the source in the two processes. And the emphasis wasn't really so much on the question of violating or violence, but the emphasis was really on the question of returning to the source and finding the source. Have I correctly summarized your answer and your question? I mean, Kemang's answer and Pro's question. If not, I'll give you space to clarify, but I hope I have summarized it. Am I correct?
Yeah, I think really what it is, it's a process of coming back to the source. It's a resuscitation for me. That's why I prefer, even in fact in the film, excuse me, even in the film, rejuvenation.
That's so beautiful, and yeah. I hope that has. Okay, then the chat is responding and saying, then I respectfully do not think that the film returned to the source. It was Abdul's artistic interpretation of Mancoba's work, i.e. a separate work. Would either of you like to comment on that, or Abdul himself? But I wanted to just throw into this discussion that one of the things that Mancoba found very beautiful and very profound was that when he was in Denmark, just after the war, they were doing very similar excavations of the kalkmalere, the murals, which were found on the Danish churches, which had been painted pre-perspective, which have lovely, they have lovely depictions of Danish folk tales and other things within them. And he really enjoyed the way they emerged from the layers of paint over them. So that's just an aside, Kemang, that you might find interesting. But just on the question of the fact that Abdul's film or video art is a separate work. It's not a return to the source. Again, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm summarizing. You're talking about returning to the source in terms of meaning. But could you perhaps elaborate on that and respond to that last question?
Is that directed to me?
Well, it's directed to you and to Kemang. The comment is from Winnie to everyone. I respectfully do not think that the film returned to the source. It was Abdul's artistic interpretation of Mancoba's work, i.e. a separate work. So Pro, I think you're ready to rock and roll?
Yes, of course. You know what's interesting about this dialogue? It's a dialogue about the dialogue. Let's continue the dialogue. Who's violating who? And what's violence? What do we mean when we talk about violence and violating? The conqueror and the colonized. I think it's the important thing that we have to think about and really think and rethink and keep thinking so that the next generation can be able to reconstruct, like Bakari said, educational wise. What are we educating our future generation? What are we talking about when we speak of education? Are we trying to say we begin left or right? Where are we? What message are we actually saying instead of dilly-dallying about the reality that we live in? Thank you.
Just said Pro reminds me very much of what Ernest Mancoba said in 1953 when he made the contribution to the issue of Musée Vivant, which Sheikh Anta Diop was the editor of. He said, yeah, I could read it out, but I don't want to extend this. You wanted to say something, Kemang?
No, I wanted to bring Thembi back into the dialogue.
Is he here? Thembi
No, he left. He threw it a stone and he left.
he needs to be here to finish this.
No, I would like to intervene. One thing, Kemang, sorry. One thing is very important, that our history is violent.
Yeah.
Our expression is violent. Our daily existence itself is violent. So even when we say, I have the right to exist, I cannot say softly with the flowers. I have to say with the stones on a bazooka. I fucking exist and I don't condone anyone else to come close to me. So I don't understand where these children of the flower notion comes to us. We don't have that notion of children of the flower. I don't have a sense of guilt. And I don't have a permanent notion of mindset of being a victim. No, I historically have been wronged and I have to fight for saying I exist. That take an example that even when we talk about modernism, when we spoke about Rashid Arain, who's the gentleman who spoke about the Rashid Arain? My blood pressure went up to high sky roof. Rashid Arain is an askari.
Abdulkadir, I don't think that this is the place to insult people.
No, I'm not insulting, I'm defining the person. Rashid Arain is someone who stands there in order to defend the value of the Western society and what do you call it? The gatekeeper of the Western value and toward the rest of Africa. He is even, I had a debate with him here in Cape Town. And I said to him, why are you afraid to mention Africa as the father of humanity and all these things, that everything originated here? And you are afraid even to say that these people exist. So one thing is very important. So we have to be conform and not being diplomatic and everything and pussyfooting about where we stand and what we do. We cannot ride two horses to be truthful to ourselves and to accommodate someone else. If we have to be true to ourselves, we have to confront our reality. Not the past, not only the one we stand for, and also the one who is coming in front of us. is negation of the negation of the negation. It's a colonial concept. Why colonialism could not have existed if someone else will have given the right and dignity. That is the reason why colonialism is. And the artist, the most important thing, what gives the strength is that he speaks the unspeakable and says the unsayable. It's not a pussyfooter or what do you call it, something else like that. He's someone who tells the truth as it is. So, stone thrower, Tembigosi, you throw stones and you run away. And you say, no, I didn't meant already in a postmodernism, I didn't, no,
okay,
no.
I'm going to conclude now. Hang on.
But I think, Bridget, it's what Abdul is saying is very interesting because in order, of course, like liberation struggles and freedom historically have to be acquired through violence. So my question now, or my interest with the violation or violence that Kemang was speaking about, it's unfortunate that it's gone because I wanted to ask whether he feels like working on Mancoba's painting without his permission, right? Because there was a mention of collaboration here, right? But what right do we have to our history and legacy is the question then, in order for us to reinterpret it.
See, that is one important thing, Bridget, hold a second. One important thing, Mancoba, when he talks about, what do you call it, what permission do we have to speak about or interpreting his work, means don't touch it, don't reveal it. It's a form of colonial repression. So don't touch that subject matter. Why you don't have permission of the person? It's not that. Mancoba put there. And it's my right to read it and to represent what it is. But if someone comes to me and said, you don't have the right to talk, I will read something which is chipile, what they call cheap. So if you are unable to confront the reality or reading the reality, is something else. But I don't have to ask permission.
As chair, I would like to read from Ernest Mancoba. I wasn't going to, but I'm going to now, because I think he has the answer to these questions. He said in 1953, I believe that we all bear some responsibility. My forefathers should never have allowed Europeans to deprive them of their African heritage. They should have struggled and passed on to their children, as well as their children's children, a culture of resistance, until such time when on both sides it became possible to speak to one another on a basis of equality and mutual respect. The world has become more and more of a single entity to such an extent that we have to reconsider all our views and opinions on racial distinctions because they have become obsolete and dangerous. I think that Ernest Mancoba, judging from his 1953 words, would have been in sync with the spirit of this conversation. And I think that we have had a very rich discussion today. I'm very grateful for it. And I want to thank everybody. It's a great pity that Thembinkosi wasn't here to end off this discussion. But I would like to end the discussion by thanking all the participants very much and thanking our chair, Zubaydah Jaffer, who's with us today, and again thanking Alain Spielman, who is here with us from Paris, and inviting him, for those of you who weren't here last week, Alain Spielman was Ernest Mancoba's very close friend for many years. He and his wife and Ernest and Sonia and their families, their children, were close friends. And I don't know if Alain would like to say something as a last word. It's very precious to have you here. And thank you.
Yes, thank you, Bridget. You hear me? Oh, well.
I can hear you.
You can't hear me.
We can hear you, Alain.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can only hear you.
Yes, we can hear you.
Can you hear me? No.
Yes.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you, and I would like to say I'm very pleased to see Mancoba's work discussed by all the artists around the table. And I'm sorry I haven't seen the film. I joined you a bit late, but I will see it with a great pleasure. And I find very interesting to hear how the work of Ernest responds to you all. This means Ernest is still among us, still living among us. And I am very pleased to notice that he is living, and he and his son Mark Wanga also, and of course his wife.
Thank you, Alain. And remembering Wanga, I'd like to mention that when Wanga saw the film at the exhibition, he cried, and he said, "This film really understands what my father was trying to do." So that's a beautiful word of endorsement for the film. So with that, I'm going to close the meeting. And again, thank you all very, very much. Thank you, Alain, for joining us. Thank you, Imruh, very, very much. Thank you, Pro. Thank you, Kemang. Tandor's had to leave already. He sent his, oh, he's still here. He's still here. Thank you, Tandor. And everybody who contributed and all the regulars. Thank you so much. It's really been a good discussion. There's one last comment in the chat. There's a last comment in the chat that everybody can read. I agree that Abdulkadir's interpretation of the work is another work, and it is right to do so. Since time immemorial, artwork has been dissected and interpreted. Others can agree and appreciate or reject it, but interpretations are not violations as such. They are subjective responses, and we all have the right to respond in our own way. Thank you, all of you, and goodbye.
Let's reread the ancestor again, because we are the ancestors. Thank you.
Should we play it again? For anybody who wants to.
Let's reread the ancestor, because we are the ancestors of tomorrow.
Thank you, Pro. All the best.
Thank you, Bridget. Thank you, Abdulkadir. Thank you, folks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you indeed.